Okay. Okay, so here we are. Thank you for joining me. We are in the fourth of the five parshas that talk about the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and its construction. And so I am going to pull out certain aspects of this week's Torah portion that I think are worth highlighting. But it's not going to take me an hour to do that. And so I also brought for you something that I prepared on a woman in Tanakh. I don't want to give too much away. It's part of another chapter of the book, but I prepared this, and I actually taught some of it to on Shabbat afternoon. There's a women's Torah class in my neighborhood, and they invited me to come and to teach, and I taught some of it there. And I also talked about you guys. They were blown away, by the way. Like when Jews hear about people like you who don't know, like I am so proud to be associated with you guys, but it's they were all um, they were blown away. Helen, I have to tell you, you told me something and I repeated it to them, sort of paraphrasing that when you can see that in the Torah that there are these connections being made between this part of the Torah, that part of the Torah, and it makes you, this is my paraphrase of what you said, like anxious to know God better. I said this to them, and they, to a person, they all went, "Wow." So they're very impressed to know about you, and I am very proud to be with you. Okay, so let's talk. This week's Torah portion is called Vayakel, and it is in the book of Exodus, the book of Shemot, chapter 35, from the very beginning, verse 1, until 38, verse 20. This week's parsha and next week's parsha actually fairly often are read together. They're both a little shorter, and they are connected in theme because they are, again, about the building of the Mishkan. But the this year they are on different weeks. So this year is Vayakel, next week is, I'm sorry, this week is Vayakel, next week is Pekude. But the name of the parsha, Vayakel, means and he gathered. And it's found, as always, in the very first, it's the first significant word in the first verse of this parsha. Who gathered who? Moshe assembled the people of Israel, the children of Israel, and he reiterates to them the commandment to observe Shabbat. Okay. And then he conveys in more detail God's instructions regarding making this Mishkan, making this tabernacle. And he asks for donations of raw materials. So the people respond. We're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. These required materials in tremendous, like so generously that eventually Moshe has to tell them, stop bringing stuff because we have enough. Okay. And so what did he ask for? Gold, silver, copper, blue, purple, and red dyed wool, goat hair, linen, animal skin, wood, olive oil, herbs, and precious stones. These are all things that are going to be necessary for building the Mishkan. And once all the materials were collected, this team of artisans started to make the Mishkan and its furnishings. And we've talked about this in the three previous Torah readings of Truma, Tetzaveh, and Kitisa. Um, this is all these five parshiot are like a group. And what are some of the things that they made? So these things all have mystical, deep significance, but I'm just going to name them for you. 48 gold-plated wall panels, 100 silver foundation sockets, the parochet, which is the curtains. If you go into a synagogue today, in front of wherever the Torah scroll is kept, there is a curtain. That's the parochet. The I guess you could call it a veil. A curtain is a better translation. In this case, the curtain that's separated between the two chambers of the sanctuary, the screen in front of it, the ark, and its cover with the kruvim, which in English is cherubs, the special table, the special showbread, the seven-branch menorah with its specially prepared oil, the altar with its incense, the anointing oil that we talked about last week about the special oil that Moshe only ever made one batch, and we hope someday to find the rest of it. The outdoor altar for burnt offerings, the hanging posts, foundation sockets for the courtyard, the basin, the petals, all of that made out of copper. Okay, why am I emphasizing this? Because as I mentioned last week, that the Mishkan is a place sort of where heaven and earth meet. It's a physical location where God is able to be in communication with humanity. And as such, it has to be done in a very precise way. And there are certain miracles that are associated. I want to focus on the Aron Kodesh, which is the Holy Ark, okay? Because our rabbis attribute certain two particularly miraculous qualities to this Aron Kodesh, that it's like it is a physical thing in a supernatural realm. And I'll tell you what I mean. The Aron Kodesh is where the luchot, the tablets of, what do we call them? The tablets of testimony were placed. Okay. And it was in the inner part of the Mishkan. And it has a physical size that's mentioned in the Torah. However, the Talmud says that from a physical perspective, it didn't take up any room at all, because the place where it was, the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh Kodashim, was measured at 20 amot. Amot is a biblical measurement that, sorry, that 20 amot, that is a biblical measurement. Let's call it, it wasn't 20 meters. It was maybe, um, okay, so something's going on in my background. Hang on, hang on just a second. Sorry about that. Okay. Um, let's start again. The Holy of Holies is listed as being 20 amot wide, but it also says that there was a space of 10 amot on one side of the Aron Kodesh, on one side of the Holy Ark, and 10 amot on the other side. Now, how do we understand that? That means that the Aron has no, it doesn't take up any space, right? Because if the whole space, let's use meters, okay? If the whole, it's not that big, but I think an amot is like basically from your fingertip to your elbow. I don't know, what is that, like a little bit more than a foot. Um, we're told two things at the same time, that the space that it was put in was 20 amot wide, but there was 10 amot on one side and 10 amot on the other side. Now that does not compute, right? So how do we understand that? Okay. If imagine a computer programmer, let's say a gamer, somebody who's playing a computer game has to work with the rules of the game. Okay. But a computer programmer can change the rules of the game because they exist outside or above the game. In the same way, God can change nature because he exists outside of or above the rules that he put in place. Now, most of the time, God chooses to operate within the laws of nature that he created, but sometimes, and this is one of those times, that isn't the case. He functions outside the limitations of the natural world. So we can't understand what that means, that there's an Aron, that there's an ark that is a physical object that exists, but it doesn't actually take up any space in the Holy of Holies. Like that doesn't make sense to us. But it is one of those it is one of those miracles of the of Tanakh, miracles of godly um, presence in the world, that that we just understand that our way of seeing the world is finite, and our way of seeing time is linear, and God exists outside of those limitations. Okay, so he can make an Aron that takes up no space at all, but is actually a physical thing. It's just it's a crazy thing. Okay. So the Aaron, the ark was the place where God spoke to Moshe and taught him, continued to teach him the Torah after he came down from Mount Sinai. So it was the point of connection between God and this world. And it's the closest thing in this world to something that's outside of this world and its limitations. I think it's valuable just for us to consider that, there's an expression in English, what you see is what you get. So when you are a religious person, when you are a God-fearing person, that isn't necessarily always the case because God exists in a realm be outside of or above or whatever that concept of the physical world that we live in. Okay, here's another miracle that's associated with this Holy of Holies. I mean, with this Holy Ark. Okay, another miracle has to do with its weight. So a lot of it, including the lid and the cruvim, the cherubs that were on top. Can you guys picture what I'm talking about? If some of you are not familiar, I can send a picture of of what it looks like. But it has these two sort of winged, they're not like angels in Judaism are not like that. Um, but the two winged beings on top of the Holy Ark were made of gold. So the cover's made of gold, and the cruvim, the two cherubs, are made of gold. In the natural world, that would weigh quite a lot. It actually would be too heavy to carry naturally on people's shoulders. So the way that it worked is there was this box with a lid with these golden cherubs on top, and on the sides of the box there were rings, and they would put poles in the rings, and men, I guess it was men, would carry, I think it was four men would carry the poles and thus carry the ark when they had to move it around. However, it being solid gold, it was way too heavy for normal human beings to carry, and yet we know that it moved. Now, how is that possible? So again, in the Gemara, rabbis say that actually the special quality of the ark was that it carried those who carried it. So if you were to pick up something heavy, let's say a brick, and move it from one place to another, you would have you would need a certain amount of muscle strength to pick it up, to hold it while you're walking, and to put it someplace else. This was physically impossible to do with the Holy Ark. So the Holy Ark, I don't know, it's like levitation or some crazy thing. Like it carried itself, but it also carried those who carried it. So I thought that was interesting and worth highlighting because again, it points out this idea of things in the material world that are imbued with spiritual qualities often have um physical, I don't know how to say this. They have like physical qualities that are not normal. They're not like they don't follow the laws of nature. I'll give you another example. This is off the top of my head that it is said that in the days of the Holy Temple on Yom Kippur, and no matter how crowded the temple was, there's a part of the Yom Kippur service where you bow down and you actually lay flat on the ground. Now, some people do that literally today in a synagogue. Some people just bow down. There's different versions of it, but the idea is to on Yom Kippur to lay your body flat. That would require a whole lot more room than everybody just like standing one next to each other, right? So that it is said that there was room for that. Even if before that part of the prayer service came up, everybody was packed in like sardines, somehow it expanded so that everybody could lay down at and prostrate themselves at that point. So that's another example of like a miracle of a supernatural nature of God. I don't know, is this a fair way to say it? Manipulating the rules of nature in order to accomplish a spiritual goal. Okay. If you look in a little further into the chapter, the first chapter that we are talking about here, the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, chapter 35, verse 22, it says, the men came with the women. Every generous hearted person brought bracelets and earrings and rings and buckles, all kinds of golden objects, and every man who waved a waving of gold to the Lord. Okay, so I want to focus on those three words, with the women. According to the Ramban, with the women means that even though the verse mentions the men came with the women, that the men were secondary to the women. In other words, the proper understanding of this verse is that the women came first to donate their precious items to the construction of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. And there's an interesting lesson in here because it's completely different behavior than than the demand for them to donate to build a golden calf, which they refused to participate in. So they jumped at the chance to donate to this cause with with the same jewelry that they were asked to bring just a short time before. We understand in retrospect that their refusal to donate to the golden calf wasn't because they were stingy. Rather, the women were anxious to donate to this project because it was a holy endeavor rather than a sinful project. Another sort of feminine aspect of these vessels and so forth is something that actually I didn't emphasize last week, but in this context, I want to say more about it. In last week's Parsha, which was Kitisa, we learned that there was a command to build a copper wash basin for the Kohanim, for the priests, in order to wash their hands before they would perform any service in the Mishkan. You can see this exact demand or command in the Shemot, in the book of Exodus, chapter 30, verse 18. This is God talking to Moses. You shall make a washstand of copper and its base of copper for washing, and you shall place it between the tent of meeting, that's the Mishkan, a part of the Mishkan, and the altar, and you should put water in it. Okay. Now, where does the copper come from? The copper from which this copper washstand, which is called in Hebrew a kior, is made, came from the women. And here's a deeper explanation. Okay. When Moshe puts out the call, we need this, we need that, we need some of this, whatever, the women gathered at his tent in order to bring him the copper mirrors that they used in Egypt. What did they use them for? They used them to beautify themselves. There's a little bit more to the story. Moshe was actually uncomfortable to accept these mirrors because he knew that they had been used in order when the women were romancing their husbands. Okay. And he doesn't want to take them because they are associated with sexual arousal. And he doesn't want to put that in this holy place. And God says to him, definitely take them. They are very, very precious to me. So here's more of the backstory. Because of these mirrors, the Israelites, the children of Israel proliferated in Egypt. So the men are out working in the fields all day long, and they are or building bricks or whatever they're doing. They're exhausted from laboring under Egyptian bondage. And the righteous women would go out and greet them and bring them food and drink. And then they would try to encourage their husbands to be with them intimately. So one of the things that they would do is they would use this mirror in a playful kind of way, have both of their faces in the mirror and say, "Oh, I'm more beautiful than you are." And in this way, they would um, awaken their husband's desire to be with them. Okay. And it's with these mirrors, that's why Moshe didn't want to use them because it was a little hanky panky, whatever. But that God said, no, these are very holy, these are very sacred, because from this, the Jewish people, well, the Israelite people proliferated. They were able to continue to have children. And so this relationship, um, this mirror that can be an instrument just of vanity was seen by God as being very precious. And so I just want to go just a little bit deeper into Um, in Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, Shlomo Melech, King Solomon compares our relationship to God with that of a husband and a wife. So the relationship with God is the foundation on which our purpose and our mission as a people, I'm speaking of the nation, was established. Every mitzvah, every prayer, every bit of Torah study, everything that we learn comes down to connecting to God, being one with God. And the sort of natural analogy of that, or the mirror of that, is a relationship between a husband and wife, which is a very central in Jewish thought. And so the mirrors that brought the husband and the wife together were not only able to be used, but they were the most precious of all of the donations, and so important that the kior, that the wash basin that was constructed from them, was a necessary um, prerequisite for any service that was going to go on in the Mishkan. So, so it goes from so Hashem sort of straightened out Moshe's thinking on this and said, not only are they not acceptable, but they are so acceptable. I want you to use them for this kior, this wash basin that is so central to the service of the Mishkan that it's impossible for the Mishkan to function without it. And actually, the wash basin and the copper stand that were made out of these mirrors was placed in the center of the action in the Mishkan and in the temple. It wasn't hidden away in a corner somewhere. It was constantly seen, and it was a constant reminder not only of the importance of the relationship between the people and God, but also between a husband and a wife. Okay, that is the piece of Vayakel that I thought was worth sharing and worth giving over. But in this last half hour, I want to talk about a woman who played a very big role in last week, and that is Vashti. Okay. Now, Vashti doesn't get a lot of play in the book of Esther. Esther gets a lot of play, but Vashti's only there for a couple of verses and then she disappears from the scene and the whole everything changes. So I wanted to go more deeply into her story. How did she become queen in the first place? What actually happened? What happened to her? All that stuff. So that's what I want to share with you today. And this material will eventually be, God willing, incorporated into a chapter of the book that I hope to finish at some point, God willing. Okay. How did she become queen in the first place? There are a couple of theories about this, but one thing that seems to be undisputed is that she comes from an important family. Her father is Belshazzar, who is familiar to you perhaps from the book of Daniel, who himself was either the son or the grandson of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, who is the one who destroyed the first temple in 586 BCE. So her grandfather or her great somebody in her line destroyed the temple. Belshazzar, who is her father, is from that line, and that's where Vashti comes. Okay. There's a tradition that one day Belshazzar hosted Koresh, who is also known as Cyrus the Second, also known as Cyrus the Great or Cyrus the Persian, and also what we call in Hebrew Daryavesh, Darius the Mede. There's this lavish banquet going on. At this point, Vashti is a relatively young girl, not yet a teenager. If you are familiar with the book of Daniel, in chapter 5, verse 5, it talks about the famous handwriting on the wall. And it says, at that time, the fingers of a human hand emerged and wrote opposite the candelabrum on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the palm of the hand that was writing. That king is Belshazzar. That king is Vashti's father. Okay. Um, as an aside, there is a lack of clarity about Koresh, Cyrus, and Darius. Some say it was the same person. Some say they ruled concurrently. There's a whole bunch of stuff about this what's the word I'm looking for? This empire and that empire. Some say that Darius was the uncle of Cyrus. In any case, at this banquet, what Darius for sure was there. Now, Cyrus the Persian is known in Jewish history as Koresh, and at the beginning of his reign, he gave royal permission for the exiled Jews to return to Israel and start rebuilding the temple. So the whole Purim story, the whole book of Esther, happens in the approximately 70 years between the destruction of the first temple and when the nation of Israel is invited back to rebuild the second temple. Okay. Koresh, Cyrus the Persian, this guy, sent back, and this is all discussed in the book of Ezra, just so you have some idea. He sent back vessels from the first temple. He financed the purchase of building materials. And if you look at the book of Ezra, the first 7 chapters, you'll see this. In any event, going back to this is beforehand. Going back to this feast at the palace of Belshazzar, there's one opinion is that this heavy candelabrum on the wall fell on Belshazzar's head and he died on impact, or he was assassinated. Something big and chaotic happened at this feast. And these events, whatever they were, threw the whole palace into chaos, which included murder and looting. And now there's no king, right? Because the king's just been assassinated or he's just been beheaded by this heavy candelabrum that fell on him, whatever. So Darius moves to occupy his seat. So there's a special, I guess his throne or some special place that everybody knows that's where the king sits. Vashti, who is a young daughter at this time, is running through the pandemonium and she's trying to find her father. And so she goes to the seat where she knows that he usually sits. And there is a man there, but that man was not her father because her father's dead now. It was Daryavesh, it was Darius sitting in her father's seat. So one opinion is that um, Daryavesh sort of adopted her and he gave her to his son Achashverosh. I don't who is the I don't know what you guys call him, Ahasuerus or something like that. I don't know how to pronounce it. We call him Achashverosh. That she was given to him in marriage. That's one of the theories. There's another tradition that actually, so Vashti was of royal birth, and Achashverosh was a servant in her father's household, but he was sort of being groomed to become part of the royal family when she married him. According to this second opinion, there's a difference in their status. Okay. And the difference in their status sheds new light on Vashti's refusal to come when she is summoned in his drunken state. And there's a whole midrash about what she says to him. It didn't happen like this. This is the way it appears to happen. He says, "Come and dance naked with only your crown in front of my friends." And she says, "No, I'm not coming." And he says, "Off with her head." Okay, that's the sort of the shorthand version of how it happened. But actually, there was a fair amount of back and forth. And in one of the back and forth conversations, she says to him, "You are my father's steward. You are a servant in his house. My father, Belshazzar, would drink wine like the way 1,000 men would drink wine, and he would never become so inebriated and make this foolish demand like you're making." And there's a couple of insults in this message, right? She's reminding him that his status as a king is only because he married her, and she doesn't think too highly of him. Um, and that could come from the idea that he was, in fact, a commoner who only became the king when he married her. And what is reasonable to expect or to understand is that Vashti must have thought that she should have been, the top banana. She should have been the regent, but instead it was given to this man that she was because she's from this royal line. In any case, um, according to the Midrash, Vashti was one of 4 women ever who shared rulership over the whole world. So 2 of them come from Israel. One of them is Isabel, who you probably know as Jezebel, who was the wife of King Achav. That story is told in Malachim Aleph in First Kings. And Atalia, whose story is told in Malachim Bet, Second Kings. She reigned over Yehuda for 6 years. Not a very well-known character, but she was a queen who shared rulership. Vashti, and this name I never heard, but I came up with it. I came to it in my research. Samu Ramat, who lived in the 9th century BCE, was another woman who ruled the world. Okay, now let's go a little bit further back in time. Now we're going to talk a little bit about reincarnation. Esther, this is a fairly well established fact, what I'm going to tell you now. Esther is a reincarnation of Chava, Eve. And when people come back in a reincarnation, they come back because they have to fix something. So what does Esther have to fix that Chava did? Well, when Eve, convinced Adam to eat from the Eitz Hadas Tov V'Ra, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, she caused death to come into the world. Specifically, she caused his death. How's she going to make up for this? The way to make up for that is to save him from death. Okay. Now he's already dead, so she can't actually save him from death. But and Esther is not actually Chava; she's a reincarnation of Chava. But in Esther's time, the mission that was given to Chava has now devolved onto the Jewish people. And the proof text of this is in the book of Yecheskel, in the book of Ezekiel, when God says to the Jewish people, Adam Atem, which means you are Adam. Okay. And so this is in Yecheskel, in Ezekiel chapter 34, verse 31. This is God speaking to the Jewish people. You are my flocks, the flocks of my pasture. You are Adam Atem. I am your God, said the Lord God. Okay. So in other words, the Jewish people have now replaced Adam. Adam had a mission. He failed to complete it. The Jewish people are now charged with this mission. So how can Chava make up for causing Adam's death by saving his life? And that's exactly what Esther did. She saved the life of the Jewish people, who are the replacement for Adam. Is this making sense to you? Am I explaining this? Okay. Now, what does that have to do with Vashti? Okay. So there's a teaching that when Adam came into the world, he came with two feminine spirits. The Chava that we know, the Eve that we know, is known as Chava Shnia, the second Chava is how you would translate it. But there was also a woman or a feminine spirit that came before the Chava that we know, the Chava Shnia, the second Chava, and that's we will call Chava Rishona, the first Chava, the first Eve. And she is known more commonly as Lilith. Okay, so Chava Rishona represents the quality of stern judgment, and the Chava that we know, the Eve that we know, Chava Shnia, represents the quality of compassion or chesed, and so forth. So there's a teaching that the Chava Rishona, the first one, the one that's out of the picture, was created from the earth, exactly the way Adam was created from the earth. But the second Chava, Chava Shnia, is the one who was created from Adam's side, his rib, however you understand that biblical story. Now, this Chava Rishona character, the one that precedes the Eve that we know, had a very strong personality and wouldn't give in to God. And according to tradition, she was banished from the Garden of Eden, and that she eventually turned really bad. She became the mother of Shadim, the mother of demons. And so, just as Esther is a reincarnation of, I want to say like Linda the Good Witch, like Chava, the one that we know, Vashti is connected to Chava Rishona, aka Lilith. So Vashti and Esther are related souls going all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Esther basically contained the not very sophisticated, but like the good part, and Vashti contained the bad part. Now, what did Vashti do wrong? So we know that she refused to come when the king commanded her. Okay, so but what did she do wrong? So let's talk about that. But I I want to say that there's a verse that is often either overlooked or not deeply understood, or not understood correctly according to the Jewish understanding, in the book of Esther, chapter 1, verse 13. So this whole thing, Vashti's refused to come, and the king, as is his custom, speaking of Achashverosh now, he wants advice. What do I do now? What am I supposed to do with her? And this verse says, and the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for so was the king's custom, to present the case before all who knew law and judgment. So he's going to get advice. He's going to phone a friend. Okay. And the Talmud asks, who are these wise men who know the times? Who is he turning to? And according to the Talmud, these are the Jewish sages of that time. Achashverosh turned to them, as was his custom, to ask, what do we do about Vashti, given that she refused to appear when she was commanded? And the rabbis recognize this is a lose-lose proposition. If we say she should be killed, and then Achashverosh sobers up and he starts looking for her, he's going to be, we're going to be punished because he's going to be very angry with us that we gave him the advice to kill her. If we say he should just ignore it, that's also not good advice because you can't tolerate insubordination when you're the king. So rather than pick either of these options, they avoid the whole dilemma. And this is what they say to Achashverosh. From the day that the temple was destroyed, which at this time is 70 years previous, and we have been exiled from our land for 70 years, counsel and insight have been removed from us, and we do not know how to judge capital cases. Okay. In other words, they said, we're not touching this one. Um, but they're phrasing it in such a way that we are in exile away from our land, and we're not wise enough to answer you in this very important issue. You should take it to other people who are settled and are not in exile, and that's in fact what the king does. I find that very, very interesting. In any case, the rabbis in the Talmud portray Vashti really very negatively. And she's literally referred to in the Talmud as a lewd woman, which is interesting in this respect. When I first became interested in Judaism, and I in a serious way, and I became interested in everything that had to do with like women and women in the Bible and so forth, I learned that there is a certain way of thinking that basically applauds Vashti because she stood up to the king and he asked her to do something unreasonable and she refused. And you could see that in other circumstances without the rest of the story, that would be very admirable. And it would be evidence of a strong woman, but that's not the way that she is portrayed in Jewish thought. So so I told you that the Talmud refers to her as a lewd woman, and the rabbis argue that actually Vashti wanted to present herself naked in front of her husband and his guests, but she declined to do so for one of two reasons. One opinion is that she was struck with a case of leprosy or some kind of skin ailment. And the other opinion was that the angel Gabriel came and made her grow either a tail or some other unusual appendage. Okay. So she's ready to do it. And then she takes a look at herself, and um her whole body is not something that she wants to put on display now in this supernatural way. According to the Midrash, as part of her refusal, I told you before that there's this whole conversation that goes back and forth. Okay, so she's, even though she would have been willing if her body wasn't either covered with some kind of rash or she hadn't grown a tail or some other unusual appendage, she sends him three arguments. One thing she says to him is, look, if your friends think that I'm beautiful when they see me, they're going to want to take advantage of me. And to get to me, they're going to kill you. So that's not smart on your part. And if they consider that I'm not attractive, then you're going to be embarrassed. That was her first argument. Okay. Achashverosh did not buy this argument. So she says, and now she's speaking about the difference in their status. She said, when you were the stable boy in my father's house and you brought naked prostitutes to play with at that time, now you're the king and you're still doing this like boy unsophisticated actions. And now she's trying to embarrass him. That didn't work either. And then she says, in my father's house, even if somebody came to be judged, they were not brought in front of my father, the King Belshazzar, to be judged naked. They were fully dressed. Okay, so these are her arguments for why she can't come. And according to this midrash, Achashverosh he's either oblivious, but he in any case he doesn't accept any of her arguments. And so she's appealed to his logic, she's appealed to his sense of honor, she's appealed to his compassion. But Achashverosh has a characteristic way of responding rashly to things. We see that repeatedly in the book of Esther. So, in any case, whether she refused the command because the sudden appearance of leprosy or a tail or some other appendage, we understand it was a supernatural event that not only prevented her from appealing, but also caused her to be banished from the kingdom. So God is setting the stage for Esther to enter the story through this, because whatever happened to her, it's not like she fell and she broke her arm. Like there was something very highly unusual. But there are several other transgressions that the rabbis say that Vashti is guilty of, and I'm going to point them out to you. First of all, Hashem was not happy with these celebrations in the first place. Why? Because both Achashverosh in his men's party and Vashti in her women's party were serving people using the vessels from the temple. So when Vashti's grandfather or great grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, um, he doesn't just destroy the temple, he also carries off all of the holy vessels of the temple. And now at this party, these vessels are being used to serve wine at these drinking parties, which, by the way, her father also did. So that's one of the things that God is already not happy that these not happy is sort of an understatement, but God is disgusted by the fact that they are taking these holy vessels that came from the first temple and using them for such a low purpose as to serve wine at these drinking parties. Okay. And we know that Vashti was guilty of that. There's also in the Megillah, in the book of Esther itself, chapter 1, verse 10, it says that this whole incident with the king calling her happened on the seventh day when the king's heart was merry with wine. So the Talmud on this verse says, what was the seventh day? You can probably guess. It was Shabbat. And it further explains why Vashti was destined to be called to appear naked specifically on Shabbat. And the Talmud answers by saying that it was her custom that she would bring Jewish girls to serve her in the palace on Shabbat, make them serve her without clothing. She would strip them naked and make them work for her on the Shabbat. So according to this principle of mida keneged mida, measure for measure, she was ordered to appear naked on Shabbat because that's what she did to the Jewish servant girls that were there. Okay. I told you that Vashti is connected to the destruction of the first temple through her grandfather who destroyed it, or her great grandfather, whatever. But also not just the vessels that they used to serve wine, but both Vashti and Achashverosh were parading around in the banquet wearing the clothes of the high priest, garments that were stolen when the temple was destroyed. So the truth is, well, another layer of this is that these grand banquets, there was a general air of debauchery. Some people say they were, one opinion is that they were conducted, I guess, to celebrate the marriage of Achashverosh and Vashti. But both the king and the queen planned their feast in order to trap the Jews into sinning. And Vashti specifically wanted the Jewish women in attendance to commit sexual sins. And her motive is because, remember her lineage, her grandfather or great grandfather destroyed the temple. She does not want to see the temple rebuilt. She wants to destroy or diffuse, I'm not sure if that's the right word, any merit that the Jews had so that they would not be worthy of rebuilding the temple. Okay. And she convinces Achashverosh not to agree to let the Jews build the temple, using the argument, you want to rebuild what my grandfathers destroyed. And so, with that action, she sealed her own fate and she lost her position as queen. Now, Haman has a role in this. Haman has another name in the book of Esther. He is also called Memuchan. For any of you that know, I don't know if you know this in Hebrew, the word muchan, or for a woman, muchana, means ready. So you can hear memuchan and muchan. You hear the connection? He was ready on a number of occasions to jump in. And we see that throughout the Megillah, throughout the book of Esther. But in chapter 1, verse 16, he jumps in and he says to the king, it is not against the king alone that Vashti the queen has sinned. Rather, it is against all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of Achashverosh the king. So he's right there, bad mouthing her to the king. And there's three reasons, according to our tradition, why Memuchan, that is Haman, wanted to see Vashti punished and not be queen. One was apparently Vashti didn't like Haman very much, and there's a tradition that she would periodically slap him in the face with her shoe or her slipper. Also, apparently Vashti did not invite the wife of Haman to this lavish banquet that she made. And the third opinion is that Haman wanted Vashti out of the picture because he wanted his daughter to marry Achashverosh. Okay. Um, which actually sounds a little bit like the story of Eliezer and Abraham in terms of who's going to marry Isaac, who's going to marry Yitzchak. But that's a much holier story, and that ends the way it's supposed to end. Okay, now, um, what actually happened to Vashti? So nowhere in the text does it say that she was actually killed. So it's possible that Memuchan, aka Haman, only meant that she should be deposed, like you're not the queen anymore, and banished from the palace. But there's a recurring opinion in the Midrashim that Vashti is not just deposed, but that she's executed. And one rabbi in the Gemara says that she was killed not because she refused the command of the king to come and dance naked in front of his friends, but because of the whole thing of how she and her father misused the vessels and the garments of the temple. That was she wasn't punished because her father did it. She was punished because she repeated her father's sin. Okay. And with this piece, I will end this. Esther, wait, I want to just say something about this whole reincarnation thing, the whole Gilgal thing. In 2016, in the US, was a presidential election year, and the two primary candidates were Trump and Hillary Clinton. Do you remember this? During that time, Rabbi Alona Nava, who is in Tzfat, said on a number of occasions that Hillary Clinton was a reincarnation of Vashti. Now, I do have this one sort of, I think it's an interesting point, but I don't know. I have this one sort of interesting support for that. So Hillary Clinton is Hillary Rodham Clinton. If you write her name in Hebrew, her three names in Hebrew, Hillary Rodham Clinton, each of the three names, the numerical value, the gematria of each of her three names is 145. The gematria of the word, I wait, I always mispronounce this. Amalekia, which is like a female Amalek, a female enemy of the Jewish people, is 145, not surprisingly. That's just a little aside. That's not going in the book. I can't really justify that, but I thought it was kind of interesting. If it's, I mean, the numbers are true, but I don't know if she really was or she wasn't, but it was something that he was claiming. So I thought it was interesting. Okay, this is the last piece. Esther as the anti-Vashti. Okay, so at first, Esther is portrayed as the anti-Vashti. Vashti is willful, Vashti is headstrong, Vashti is outspoken, and Esther is initially portrayed as submissive. But we know that she has clearly learned from her predecessor because the story of Vashti highlights a major weakness in Achashverosh. On multiple occasions in the book of Esther, starting with the Vashti episode, but not only, he decrees new laws that other people present to him, not because he's thought them through and they're good for the kingdom, but out of somebody's self interest. And he's especially vulnerable to being manipulated when he's drunk. So, what does Esther do with this information? She uses it to her benefit when she invites him to parties on two successive nights. So, she wants to get him a little limber. She wants to get him not necessarily drunk so that he passes out, but like a little bit where this part of his personality is going to come to the fore so that um, she can achieve her ends. Now, Esther defied Achashverosh because she came when she wasn't called, right? That is the mirror image of Vashti, who was called but didn't come. You see, isn't that interesting? Esther came when she wasn't called. Vashti didn't come when she was called. In both cases, actually, the women acted in opposition to the power of the king, and they risked their lives in doing so. But Vashti defied Achashverosh and paid a steep price. Now, as I just went through, there were many more reasons for that. But Esther also defied Achashverosh when she came without being called, and she was rewarded. So it's interesting just to look at these two personalities side by side. Okay, that is what I prepared to share with you today. A little bit about Vayakel, a little bit about the miracles of the Aaron, about the donations and the women and all that, and this deeper story of Esther. So we have actually 5 minutes left. Would anybody like to say anything? Tell me what about this was new for you, or interesting to you, or anything else you want to say? Anybody? Margaret, yeah. Are you, I can't tell
Yeah.
if you're, yeah, okay, good.
Am I muted? Or I'm
Nope, nope,
unmuted?
I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay. One of the things that was really interesting that was new for me was about the mirrors with the women for being used for the temple. Because I was told, and you described what the mirrors were used for, but I don't know who it was or where I read it, but I was also told that this was what the mirror was what the women used to identify their men in the fields when they had to go look for them, because the only way they could find them, they were so tired, and they'd be able to use this mirror to just say, okay, yeah, this is my husband, this is my husband, so that they know who to be with. I didn't hear the part about what you were saying where they would be kidding like with two,
Flirting,
I'm
yeah.
more beautiful than you and that. So that was very, very interesting. And the other thing that you shared that was really, really new to me about the Vasti story was I always wonder what happened to her and how did she come to be the queen? Because the story doesn't give you any of those backgrounds or those
Right.
details. It just needs you to believe, because I was just like, why did she, was this a part of her personality not to come? And she had other occasions where she didn't come. It just really left me, why all of a sudden she would take these actions. So all what you shared really kind of brought insight into
So
putting
there's
all those pieces together in my mind.
Great. So there's two things I want to say. First of all, this thing about women using the mirrors to find their husbands, I never heard that. I
Okay.
heard that they would use the mirrors in the way that we talked about, flirting with them, trying to arouse them. But I never heard that they were like used in a detective kind of way to find their husbands. But the other thing that you said is Vashti is in the first few verses of a 10 chapter book of Esther. And we, if you only read that, and like that is the whole point of the book that I'm working on, and also the whole point of what I share with you guys just in general, is you can't get the whole story if all you're doing is reading Tanakh, because so much of the richness of the story is outside of the words of Tanakh. And so that you made that connection is very exciting for me, because that's like my mission, is to say, here's the part, let me expand on it and show you how much deeper the story is. Like, even I think if you let's say you take biblically literate people who know the basic story of the Book of Esther, and you say, what did Vashti do that she deserved to be killed or deposed? I'm not even sure what impression you had. What did she do? And like, I think 99 out of 100 people will say, well, she refused to dance naked in front of
Hmm.
the king and his friends, right? But that's only part of the story. There's a whole list of things that she did wrong that upset God, that made her punishment make a whole lot more sense to us, right? And I think that that makes the story that much richer. So thank you for making that connection. Anybody else? Anything you want to say,
Um,
Valerie?
I, something that I would like to say, but once you stop the recording, because
Oh,
it had to do with things you were discussing at the beginning.
okay. All right. So let me stop the recording. Let me thank you all for coming. I'm glad to have had faces to look at. Ada, that good for you for being awake and being with us. Okay, let me stop the recording and then we can speak just off the record.